A single white rose fell from trembling fingers onto polished marble as whispered words cut through the air. "Sir, you'll need to move to the back section." Command Sergeant Major James Washington stood ramrod straight, his weathered face betraying no emotion despite the sting of the coordinator's words. After traveling 300 miles to Arlington National Cemetery, the 72-year-old retired veteran wasn't about to be relegated to some distant viewing area where he couldn't properly honor Colonel Robert Hayes, the man who'd saved his life in Vietnam and remained his friend for over 5 decades. "I'm here for Colonel Hayes," Washington said, voice steady as he presented his military ID. "I served with him in '68. The young white coordinator barely glanced at the identification before pointing toward a section far from the burial site. "That's the designated viewing area, sir. We need to keep the main section clear for family and special guests." Washington's eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed several white veterans being escorted to prime positions near the grave. Their IDs received careful scrutiny before they were ushered forward with respectful nods. The morning sun glinted off Washington's silver star and the row of medals adorning his perfectly pressed dress uniform, a uniform he'd spent 3 hours preparing last night. "Colonel Hayes was my commanding officer," Washington explained, reaching into his breast pocket to retrieve a weathered photograph. "We served together in the Mekong Delta. I was with him when he took that bullet." The image showed 2 young soldiers, one black, one white, arms around each other's shoulders despite the mud and exhaustion etched on their faces. Hayes's right arm was bandaged, his uniform stained with what was undoubtedly blood that the black and white photo mercifully obscured. "I understand, sir, but I have my instructions." The coordinator's voice remained polite but firm as she gestured again toward the distant section. "The ceremony begins in 20 minutes. Washington slipped the photo back into his pocket, his mind flashing to that day in 1968. They'd been ambushed while on patrol. Hayes had shoved Washington down just as gunfire erupted, taking a bullet in the shoulder that had been meant for Washington's head. In the 5 decades since, they'd never missed each other's important life events. When Hayes made colonel, Washington had been there. When Washington's wife died 3 years ago, Hayes had stood beside him at the funeral. "He promised to be front and center at my funeral someday," Hayes had joked afterward, trying to lighten the moment. "And I expect the same from you, James." Now Washington watched as the cemetery filled with high-ranking officers, politicians, and Pentagon officials. Colonel Hayes had gone on to become a respected strategist whose battlefield innovations had saved countless American lives. This wasn't just any military funeral. It was a significant event attended by generals and dignitaries. Among the arriving officials, Washington spotted a black officer with the stars of a major general, Marcus Davis, according to the program. Washington didn't know him personally, though the name sounded vaguely familiar from military publications. As Washington considered his options, he noticed he wasn't alone in his treatment. 2 other black attendees, one in uniform, were similarly directed away from the main ceremony. The coordinator's assistant muttered something about keeping things organized and following protocol as they processed the growing line. When Washington tried again to explain his connection to Hayes, the coordinator cut him off. "Sir, these are the rules. I need to keep the line moving. Please proceed to the designated area." Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After 3 decades of military service and a lifetime of similar dismissals, would he accept this final slight at his brother-in-arms funeral? "I won't be moving to the back section." Washington's voice remained calm, each word measured and precise. "Colonel Hayes would have wanted me present for his final honors." The coordinator's smile faltered, professional courtesy giving way to visible annoyance. "Sir, we have protocols in place for a reason. There are distinguished guests and family members who need the close access." "I understand protocol better than most," Washington replied, adjusting his tie. "I also understand when it's being selectively applied." Whispers spread like ripples through nearby mourners as the coordinator beckoned to 2 military police officers standing nearby. Washington felt the familiar weight of his metal-heavy jacket against his shoulders, a burden he'd carried proudly for decades. The scent of fresh-cut cemetery grass brought back memories of too many military funerals, but never one where he'd been treated as an outsider. The MPs approached cautiously, their discomfort evident. Both were young, probably born years after Washington had retired from active duty. "Is there a problem here?" the taller MP asked, addressing the coordinator rather than Washington. "This gentleman refuses to move to the designated viewing area," she explained. "We need to maintain order for the ceremony." Washington calmly withdrew the photograph again, holding it where all three could see. "Colonel Hayes and I served together in Vietnam. He took a bullet meant for me. We remained friends for 53 years, and I promised to be here today." The MPs exchanged uncomfortable glances, their training on handling dignified veterans clearly conflicting with their current orders. "Sir, we understand your connection," the second MP said gently, "but we need to follow the established protocols for this ceremony." Washington stood straighter, his posture perfect after decades of military bearing. "Son, I've stood at attention for 30 years defending the right to be treated equally. I'm not moving to the back today." The coordinator's face flushed as several nearby mourners turned to watch the exchange. The MPs shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to escalate the situation with a decorated veteran. Would these young MPs physically remove this Silver Star recipient from his friend's funeral? A murmur began spreading through the crowd as more attendees noticed the confrontation. Several white veterans in full-dress uniform watched the exchange with growing interest, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern as they registered Washington's medals and the situation unfolding. An elegant woman in her 70s, supported by a younger man who resembled her, looked over from where she was greeting guests near the burial site. From her position of honor and the somber dignity with which others approached her, Washington immediately recognized Elizabeth Hayes, Robert's widow. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted Washington, recognition dawning on her face. They'd met numerous times over the decades at military functions and family gatherings. She whispered something to her son and began moving in Washington's direction. The funeral coordinator stepped between Washington and the approaching MPs. "Sir, you're causing a scene that dishonors the deceased. Please respect Colonel Hayes' memory by complying with our procedures." Washington calmly adjusted his Silver Star medal, the highest decoration on his chest. "I served with Colonel Hayes on 3 Pentagon policy committees. He would be the first to question why his guests are being separated this way." The coordinator's reply was cut short as she noticed Elizabeth Hayes approaching. She hurried to intercept the widow, speaking in hushed tones while gesturing toward the gathering crowd. Elizabeth's face hardened as she glanced between the coordinator and Washington, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. Her son gently guided her back toward the receiving line as more guests arrived, though she continued looking back toward Washington with evident confusion. Would anyone stand up for Washington as the ceremony was about to begin? Military band members took their positions, signaling the imminent start of the service. Guests began moving toward their seats as Washington remained standing at the perimeter, still locked in silent standoff with the funeral staff. As the final minutes ticked by, Washington noticed a young black lieutenant approaching the check-in table, official military ID in hand. Despite his crisp uniform and formal authorization, the young officer received the same treatment, a cursory glance at his credentials and directions toward the distant section. Something shifted in Washington's expression. This wasn't just about him anymore. With deliberate calm, he straightened his jacket and began walking toward the main ceremony area. The military band's somber notes filled the air, providing a dignified soundtrack to what was quickly becoming an undignified confrontation. Washington's measured footsteps crossed the manicured grass as he felt the cool metal of his service medals against his palm. The MPs immediately moved to intercept him, creating a visible disturbance at what should have been a solemn occasion. Heads turned as Washington approached the main seating area, his bearing proud despite the public confrontation. "Sir, you need to return to the designated area," the taller MP said, his voice low but firm as he positioned himself in Washington's path. "You can arrest me if you must," Washington replied evenly, but you'll be arresting a man for wanting to say goodbye to the officer who took a bullet for him." From the VIP section, Major General Marcus Davis noticed the commotion. His conversation with a fellow officer trailed off as he observed the confrontation with narrowed eyes. After a moment's consideration, he excused himself and began making his way toward Washington and the MPs. Would Washington's dignity crumble under this public humiliation, or did he have an ace up his sleeve? The MPs hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of forcibly removing a decorated veteran from a military funeral. The growing attention from high-ranking attendees only increased their discomfort. Major General Davis approached with measured steps, his expression carefully neutral. Washington immediately stood at perfect attention, a reflex ingrained through decades of service. The funeral coordinator hurried over, speaking before Davis could even address Washington. "General, we're following standard protocols for guest arrangement," she explained quickly. "We're trying to maintain order for the ceremony." Davis turned to Washington, his gaze falling to the impressive array of medals. "May I see your ID, Command Sergeant Major?" Washington produced his military ID without comment. Davis studied it carefully, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as he read the name. "James Washington," Davis said, recognition evident in his voice. "You were behind that committee recommendation from '97, weren't you?" "Yes, sir," Washington replied simply. The coordinator interjected. "General Davis, the seating arrangements were approved by command. We're just following—" "Then consider this a field override effective immediately," Davis interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned to Washington. "Command Sergeant Major, please join us in the front section. The family would want you there." What did General Davis know about Washington that had suddenly changed his demeanor? Washington sat ramrod straight in the front row of seats, separate from the main VIP section but with a clear view of the ceremony. Despite this partial victory, a complex mixture of emotions churned beneath his composed exterior. The weight of his medals felt suddenly heavy against his chest, the funeral oration becoming muffled as memories from the past 5 decades surfaced unbidden. He folded the program in his hands, creating small creases as he tightened his grip. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such treatment, not by a long shot. Similar slights had punctuated his 30-year military career, subtle redirections, explanations about protocol and procedure that somehow always ended with black service members and veterans in less prominent positions. What made today different was that he'd promised Hayes he would be there, front and center. "When my time comes," Hayes had said during their last visit, "I expect to see your ugly mug right up front, giving me one last proper salute." Now Hayes was gone, and Washington had nearly been denied the chance to keep that promise. Washington considered simply completing the ceremony and leaving without further incident. Why fight these battles at his age? He'd spent a lifetime pushing against these barriers, often at great personal cost. The military had changed significantly during his service, but clearly not enough. As the chaplain spoke about Colonel Hayes's distinguished service, Washington noticed several younger black service members watching him from their positions around the ceremony. A few wore expressions of quiet respect, having witnessed his stand against the coordinator. One young lieutenant, the same one who had been redirected earlier, gave him an almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Washington straightened in his seat. This wasn't just about him, or even about Hayes. It was about every young service member who deserved better than what he had experienced throughout his career. His mind drifted back to 1997, when he had served on a special Pentagon diversity committee. As the most senior enlisted member, he had been tasked with compiling documentation on integration practices across military installations. The findings had been troubling: persistent patterns of segregation at ceremonies, unofficial protocols that consistently placed black service members and veterans in less visible positions during public events. Washington had meticulously documented hundreds of incidents across dozens of bases. His report had recommended specific policy changes. Recommendation 23-7A had specifically addressed ceremonial integration, calling for standardized, non-discriminatory protocols for all military functions. The language had been precise, the documentation exhaustive. These recommendations would eliminate any possibility of intentional or unintentional segregation during military ceremonies, Washington had written in the executive summary. They would ensure that all service members are treated with equal dignity and respect during public functions. The report had received initial support from several progressive generals, but ultimately stalled after significant pushback from more traditional elements within the military hierarchy. "These are traditions, not discrimination," a senior officer had told him dismissively during the final review. "Know your place, Sergeant Major. Some things aren't meant to change overnight." The report had been shelved, its recommendations acknowledged, but never implemented. Washington had kept his own copy of every document, every piece of evidence, adding to the file throughout the remaining years of his service and even after retirement. It had become almost a ritual, documenting each slight, each instance of segregation, each protocol that maintained the old ways without explicitly acknowledging their purpose. As the honor guard folded the flag that had draped Hayes's coffin with ceremonial precision, Washington made a mental inventory of what he'd observed today. Black attendees systematically directed to segregated viewing areas. Credentials checked differently based on race. Protocols cited without specific reference to any actual written policy. He noticed General Davis watching him from the VIP section, his gaze thoughtful. Something about their brief interaction nagged at Washington. Davis had recognized his name, specifically mentioned the 1997 committee. Few people remembered that work. It had been deliberately buried, after all. The folded flag was presented to Elizabeth Hayes with solemn dignity. Washington's heartbeat steadied as resolution formed in his mind. He could taste the unspoken words he'd held back for too long. This pattern of discrimination had persisted for decades, hiding behind tradition and unwritten rules. Washington had spent his career documenting it while working within the system. Perhaps it was time for a different approach, not just for himself, but for every young service member watching how their elders were treated. As the ceremony concluded, Washington remained in his seat until the main party of dignitaries began to disperse. Major General Davis was speaking with a group of officers near the gravesite, but his eyes occasionally drifted toward Washington. Rather than approaching the family immediately, Washington made a deliberate path toward Davis, bypassing the coordinator who had caused the earlier confrontation. Davis seemed to anticipate this, excusing himself from the group of officers as Washington approached. The distinguished murmur of the departing crowd provided a backdrop to their meeting, with Washington's pulse steady in his throat as he came to attention before the general. The scent of polished brass and lingering gunpowder from the ceremonial rifles hung in the air. "Command Sergeant Major Washington," Davis said, extending his hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "As do I, General," Washington replied, his handshake firm. "Thank you for your intervention earlier." Davis nodded, his expression becoming more serious. "That shouldn't have been necessary. What happened today was unacceptable." "And yet entirely predictable," Washington said, his voice low but clear. "I've documented 17 separate instances of segregation during today's ceremony alone." Davis raised an eyebrow. 17? Washington didn't hesitate. Different credential checks based on race. Separate seating areas not mentioned in the program. Staff directing black attendees away from family areas regardless of their connection to the deceased. Consistent use of protocol without reference to specific written policies. He paused. All patterns I documented extensively during my service on the 1997 Ceremonial Integration Committee. Davis's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine concern. "You were the principal architect of those recommendations, weren't you? The ones that were approved but never implemented." "Yes, sir," Washington confirmed. Recommendation 23-7A specifically addressed segregation at military ceremonies. It was approved by the committee but buried in implementation. Washington reached inside his jacket and withdrew a small, worn leather notebook. "This is just one of many. I've been documenting these incidents for decades." Davis accepted the notebook, flipping through pages of meticulous notes, dates, locations, and descriptions of incidents spanning years. Washington reached into his other pocket and produced a small envelope containing photographs. These span ceremonies at 12 different installations over the past 15 years, Washington explained, as Davis examined images showing identical segregation patterns at multiple bases. I have digital records going back further, 237 documented incidents in total. Davis looked up sharply. You've been building a case file. For a potential class action lawsuit, yes, Washington acknowledged, though that's not my preferred outcome. Davis studied the evidence with increasing concern, asking pointed questions about specific commanding officers and installations mentioned in the documentation. Washington answered each question with precise details that revealed the depth of his research. I'm not interested in lawsuits, General, Washington said finally. I'm interested in fixing what's broken before another generation inherits it. Davis returned the notebook and photos, his decision visibly forming. Walk with me, Command Sergeant Major. Together, they approached the funeral coordinator and the base commander, who were overseeing the final arrangements as guests departed. The coordinator stiffened upon seeing Washington approaching with General Davis. Ma'am, Davis began, I'd like to discuss the seating protocols employed today. Of course, General, she replied, her professionalism masking any discomfort. We followed standard protocol per base tradition for distinguished service ceremonies. Could you direct me to the written policy outlining these protocols? Davis asked. The coordinator hesitated. They're part of our established procedures, sir. They've been in place for years. Washington stepped forward. Section 29 of Military Funeral Protocol specifically prohibits segregation of any kind at military ceremonies. It states that all honored guests shall be afforded equal dignity and accommodation regardless of race, gender, or background. The base commander, a colonel who had been observing from nearby, joined the conversation. General Davis, Command Sergeant Major Washington, I assure you there was no segregation intended in our arrangements. We simply organize seating to ensure proper ceremony flow. Then perhaps you can explain, Washington continued calmly, why every black attendee was directed to sections E and F, regardless of their connection to Colonel Hayes or their military rank. The commander's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation, Command Sergeant Major. Are you suggesting our staff deliberately segregated guests? I'm not suggesting anything, sir, Washington replied. I'm stating a documented fact. I observed 17 separate instances during today's ceremony alone. Washington methodically cited each applicable regulation violated by the current practices, his decades of service in military administration evident in his comprehensive knowledge of the protocols. With each citation, the coordinator's attempts to justify the procedures weakened. These are simply misunderstandings of our intentions, the base commander insisted, his defensive tone growing more pronounced. Washington reached into his jacket pocket and removed his silver star, placing it deliberately on the small table beside them. The symbolic gesture silenced everyone present. This medal was for valor under fire, Washington said quietly. Today I'm showing you what moral courage looks like. He looked directly at the commander. I didn't fight for a country where back of the bus still exists. The silence that followed was broken by General Davis. Colonel, I've been tasked by the Secretary of Defense with reviewing integration practices across all installations. Command Sergeant Major Washington's documentation provides compelling evidence of a pattern that extends beyond today's incident. The commander's expression shifted from defensive to concerned, as he realized the situation had escalated beyond a single complaint about a funeral arrangement. This isn't just about today, Davis continued. There are currently 3 congressional inquiries into military segregation practices underway. The testimony and evidence Command Sergeant Major Washington has compiled will be central to those investigations. Several white veterans who had witnessed Washington's earlier confrontation approached the group. One stepped forward, a retired colonel based on his dress uniform. General, I'd like to offer my witness statement regarding what I observed today, he said. I noticed the same pattern Command Sergeant Major Washington described. As did I, added another veteran. I found it disturbing enough that I took photos of the seating arrangements. The base commander glanced between the growing group of witnesses, his confident demeanor crumbling. General Davis, I assure you I had no knowledge of any discriminatory intent in our protocols. These procedures were in place when I assumed command. This stops today, Davis replied firmly. Not next week after a review, not after consulting command. Today. Elizabeth Hayes approached the group, her son supporting her elbow. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was resolute. I couldn't help overhearing, she said. James, Robert would have been appalled by how you were treated. He spoke often of your friendship. She turned to the base commander. My husband spent his career fighting for equality within the ranks. This dishonors his memory. The commander seemed to shrink under her gaze. Mrs. Hayes, please accept my deepest apologies. We intended no disrespect. Intentions matter less than actions, Colonel, she replied. And your actions today speak volumes. How would the base commander respond now that he was cornered by regulations, evidence, and a superior officer? General Davis, Command Sergeant Major Washington, the commander began, visibly regrouping. There appears to have been a misunderstanding of protocols. Our staff was following established procedures without questioning their origins or implications. A convenient explanation, Washington observed. Yet these misunderstandings consistently result in the same outcome. Washington calmly produced a copy of his original 1997 report from his briefcase. This report predicted exactly these misunderstandings, Colonel. It outlined how segregation could persist through seemingly neutral language and traditional practices without explicit discriminatory policies. Davis took the report, examining its yellowed pages. I want immediate access to all ceremonial protocol documents for this base. Every written policy, every memo, every training document. Of course, General, the commander agreed quickly. I'll have them assembled immediately. In my office, Davis specified. Within the hour. As the commander hurried away to comply, other black veterans who had witnessed the confrontation began approaching Washington. One elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap spoke quietly to him. I've attended 3 funerals here in the past year, he said. Same thing every time. Never said anything because I figured that's just how it is. That's how it was, Washington corrected gently. I've spent 50 years being polite about disrespect. Today, we're going to be honest instead. A review of the base protocol documents revealed exactly what Washington had documented, a systematic pattern of segregation hidden within seemingly neutral language. Procedures for efficient crowd management and dignitary accommodation contained subtle directives that consistently resulted in racial separation without explicitly mentioning race. As the evidence mounted, base personnel gathered, watching the power dynamic shift in real time. Junior officers exchanged glances as decades of unquestioned tradition were suddenly exposed to scrutiny. General Davis called an emergency meeting of all base senior officers, including those who had conducted the funeral. The base conference room quickly filled with concerned officers as word spread about the ongoing investigation. Chairs shuffled as commanders assembled, watching with evident tension as Washington arranged his evidence folders on the conference table. Gentlemen, ladies, Davis began once all were seated. What I've discovered today represents a significant failure of leadership at multiple levels. The funeral coordinator, seated near the base commander, attempted to speak. General, if I may explain our procedures. The procedures speak for themselves, Davis interrupted, holding up the protocol manual. What we have here is segregation hiding behind bureaucratic language. There is no justification for this. Washington presented his documentation methodically, walking the officers through the pattern he had observed not just today, but across decades of military ceremonies. His hands remained steady as he placed photographs and witness statements on the table, his voice never rising despite the gravity of his accusations. When we took our oath, Davis said after Washington concluded, it didn't include except when it's inconvenient or unless it's tradition. Discrimination has no place in our military, whether explicit or implicit. The base commander, looking increasingly uncomfortable, leaned forward. General Davis, Command Sergeant Major Washington. I want to be clear that I inherited these protocols. Had their implications been brought to my attention previously? That's precisely the problem, Davis interrupted. No one questioned procedures that were obviously resulting in segregation. That failure of leadership extends from the top down. Davis stood, his decision made. Effective immediately, I am issuing a base-wide protocol revision. All ceremonial procedures will be reviewed and rewritten to ensure equal treatment of all service members, veterans, and guests. The assembled officers shifted uncomfortably as Davis continued. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate audit of all ceremonial protocols across all base operations, not just funerals, but award ceremonies, parades, and official functions. Any procedure that results in segregation, intentional or otherwise, will be eliminated. Davis turned to Washington. Command Sergeant Major Washington, I am creating an oversight committee to implement these changes. I would like you to serve as a civilian consultant to ensure the new protocols align with the recommendations you made years ago. Washington nodded his acceptance, aware of the significance of this moment. Several of the younger officers around the table looked relieved, while some of the older commanders appeared resistant but remained silent. Colonel, Davis addressed the base commander directly, you will issue a public apology to Command Sergeant Major Washington and any other veterans affected by these discriminatory practices. Yes, sir, the commander replied stiffly. One more thing, Davis added. Command Sergeant Major Washington's case has helped break open a larger investigation into military ceremony discrimination. I've been informed that 3 other base commanders have been placed under review for similar practices. The tension in the room thickened as officers realized the implications extended far beyond their installation. The Secretary of Defense's office has been notified, Davis continued, and the Congressional Oversight Committee has requested a full briefing on our findings. Washington sat quietly, watching decades of work finally bearing fruit. His shoulders relaxed slightly for the first time since arriving at the cemetery that morning. Through the base headquarters windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds where Colonel Hayes had been laid to rest. After the meeting, Elizabeth Hayes approached Washington in the hallway. James, Robert would be proud of what you did today. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. I've requested a special memorial event to redo the ceremony the right way. Will you help me plan it? It would be my honor, Elizabeth, Washington replied. The base commander approached them, his manner subdued. Command Sergeant Major Washington, Mrs. Hayes, I owe you both an apology. I inherited these protocols but never questioned them. That failure of leadership is on me. Washington studied the man's face, recognizing genuine remorse. Recognition is the first step toward change, Colonel. What matters now is what you do with that recognition. Later that afternoon, as Washington prepared to leave the base, he noticed a group of young service members watching him from across the parking lot. The black lieutenant, who had also been redirected at the funeral, approached and saluted. Command Sergeant Major Washington, he said. What you did today, it matters to us, more than you know. Washington returned the salute. Lieutenant, change doesn't happen without witnesses willing to speak up. Remember that. The next morning, Washington received a call from General Davis. Command Sergeant Major, I wanted to update you personally. The protocol documents you provided have initiated a comprehensive review of ceremonial practices across all military branches. That's more than I expected, General, Washington admitted. Your documentation was irrefutable, Davis replied. The patterns you identified existed at multiple bases across different commands. This wasn't isolated. It was systemic. Washington felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a burden he'd carried for decades without fully acknowledging its toll. What happens next? I've been authorized to form a special task force, Davis explained. We'll be reviewing integration practices at every major installation. The Secretary of Defense wants recommendations within 30 days. Washington nodded to himself. Those recommendations already exist, General. They've been sitting in a file cabinet since 1997. Not anymore, Davis assured him. Your report is now on the Secretary's desk. He's particularly interested in Recommendation 23-7A. After hanging up, Washington sat at his kitchen table, emotion finally breaking through his composed exterior. 50 years of military service, and only now was his most important work being recognized. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. CSM Washington, this is Lieutenant Marcus Reynolds, the lieutenant from today. Just wanted to say thank you again. Several of us younger officers have been documenting similar incidents but didn't know how to address them. You've shown us the way. Washington typed a reply. Documentation is only the first step, Lieutenant. The next is ensuring those records don't sit in a drawer for 25 years. Over the following days, news of what had happened at Arlington spread throughout military circles. Washington received calls from veterans he hadn't spoken with in years, some sharing similar experiences, others expressing support. A reporter from Army Times contacted him for a statement, but Washington politely declined. This wasn't about publicity, it was about fixing a broken system. 2 weeks later, he returned to the base for a scheduled meeting of the newly formed Oversight Committee. As he approached the security checkpoint, the guard, a young white soldier, snapped to attention and saluted with unexpected reverence. Command Sergeant Major Washington, the guard said. It's an honor, sir. Washington returned the salute, momentarily taken aback by the reception. As he entered the administration building, he noticed something had changed. The atmosphere was different. Officers and enlisted personnel alike greeted him with a respect that went beyond military courtesy. In the conference room, the base commander was already waiting with General Davis and several staff officers. On the table lay a stack of revised protocol documents. Command Sergeant Major, the commander began, before we start, I wanted you to know that we've completed the initial review of our ceremonial procedures. Every instance of discriminatory language or practice has been identified and removed. Washington nodded but reserved judgment. I'll need to review the changes myself. Of course, the commander agreed. That's why you're here. He slid a folder across the table. We've also instituted a mandatory training program for all personnel involved in ceremony planning. No more inherited procedures without understanding their implications. General Davis smiled slightly. The commander has been surprisingly thorough, James. I think you'll approve of the changes. Washington spent the next 3 hours meticulously reviewing the revised protocols. The new language was clear, specific, and entirely neutral regarding race or background. Seating arrangements, greeting procedures, and honors were now standardized across all categories of guests, with only family members receiving special consideration. This is comprehensive, Washington acknowledged finally. It should be, the commander replied. We used your 1997 recommendations as our template. As Washington drove away from Arlington that evening, he reflected on the day's events. The confrontation hadn't been planned. He had simply come to honor his friend. But sometimes, he realized, the most important battles find you when you least expect them. What began as one man's stand at a friend's funeral had catalyzed changes that would affect countless service members for generations to come. These were the real-life stories that rarely made headlines but transformed institutions from within. Quiet revolutions fought with documentation and persistence rather than violence. Washington thought about the young lieutenant and the other black service members who had witnessed his stand. They wouldn't have to spend decades documenting discrimination only to be ignored. They could build on the foundation he had laid, push further than he had been able to go. That, he decided, was the most fitting tribute he could offer to Robert Hayes, ensuring that the country they had both risked their lives to defend lived up to its highest ideals. 1 month later, Washington returned to the base as an honored guest. The freshly painted signs directing guests to ceremony areas no longer contained the subtle codes that had previously segregated attendees. He watched with satisfaction as another military funeral proceeded, this one with fully integrated seating and no separation by race. The young black lieutenant from the Hayes funeral, now part of the protocol implementation team, greeted Washington at the gate. Command Sergeant Major, Your recommendations have changed everything. We've completely rewritten the guidelines. Washington's hand remained steady as he signed the new protocol document later that day. These changes should have happened decades ago, he remarked. But I'm grateful they're happening now. General Davis had promoted the lieutenant, citing his moral courage in supporting necessary change. The base commander, initially resistant, had become an unexpected ally in implementing the new protocols. After facing his own blind spots, he'd committed to becoming part of the solution. I never questioned why things were done a certain way, he admitted to Washington during the implementation review. That stops now. Washington had donated his decades of documentation to the military archives, ensuring the history of these practices would not be forgotten. Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, he told the archivist. Make sure this remains accessible. Elizabeth Hayes hosted the promised memorial event for her husband, with Washington in the place of honor beside her. Robert believed in equality in life and in death, she told the assembled guests. Today we honor his memory by ensuring everyone is treated with the same dignity. As Washington prepared to leave the base for the final time, he met with a group of young enlisted personnel who had requested his perspective. Among them were service members of all backgrounds, eager to hear from someone who had witnessed so much change over his lifetime. Your uniform deserves respect, he told them. Never let anyone convince you that you deserve less of it. One young soldier asked what kept him fighting for change over so many years. Dignity isn't requested or granted, Washington replied after a thoughtful pause. It's protected by those who recognize injustice. The impact of Washington's stand extended far beyond Arlington. Within 3 months, all major military installations had revised their ceremonial protocols following the template established by his 1997 recommendations. Congressional hearings brought to light dozens of similar cases, creating momentum for broader reforms throughout military culture. The Army Times published a feature article titled "The Long March to Equality," chronicling Washington's decades-long effort to document and challenge discriminatory practices. Other veterans came forward with their own stories, creating a comprehensive record of both progress and persistent challenges. Lieutenant Reynolds, inspired by Washington's example, established a mentoring program for junior officers, focused on recognizing and addressing systemic inequities. The Washington Protocol, as they called it, taught young leaders to document discrepancies, cite applicable regulations, and pursue change through proper channels. The military academy at West Point incorporated Washington's case into their leadership curriculum, using it to illustrate how seemingly neutral procedures could perpetuate discrimination and how individual moral courage could catalyze institutional change. Cadets studied the specific language of the original protocols, learning to recognize coded bias in administrative systems. Washington found himself in demand as a speaker at various military functions and veterans events. Though uncomfortable with the attention, he recognized the importance of sharing his experience. This isn't just a black story, he would tell audiences. It's an American story about living up to our professed values. During one such event, an elderly white veteran approached Washington afterward, tears in his eyes. I was at Arlington that day, he said. I saw what happened but didn't speak up. I've regretted that silence ever since. Thank you for having the courage I lacked. 6 months after Colonel Hayes's funeral, Washington received a letter from the Secretary of Defense, personally thanking him for his persistence and enclosing a copy of the new military-wide ceremonial integration directive, formally titled Protocol 23-7A, in recognition of his original recommendation. When interviewed about these developments by a military publication, Washington deflected personal credit. This was never about me, he insisted. It was about ensuring that every person who wears the uniform receives the dignity they've earned, in life and in death. The most meaningful validation came in small moments, witnessing integrated ceremonies where everyone was treated with equal respect, hearing from young service members about the difference they experienced, seeing Elizabeth Hayes smile as she told him, Robert would be so proud of what you've accomplished in his name." On the anniversary of Hayes's death, Washington visited his friend's grave at Arlington. He placed a single white rose on the headstone, a mirror of the one he had dropped when first confronted by the coordinator a year earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. "We did it, old friend," Washington said quietly. "One last mission complete." As he stood to leave, he noticed a young black cadet visiting a nearby grave. The young man straightened and saluted Washington, clearly recognizing him. Washington returned the salute with precision, then approached. "Sir," the cadet said with evident admiration, "they taught us about you at the academy last semester." Washington smiled slightly. "And what lesson did they teach?" "That real courage isn't just what you do in combat," the cadet replied. "It's what you do when no one's shooting at you but the system itself is against you." Washington nodded, satisfied. "That's a good lesson, cadet. Make sure you remember it when it's your turn to lead." The ripple effects of Washington's stand continued to spread in unexpected ways. During a Veterans Day ceremony the following November, Washington was surprised to find himself seated beside a retired general who had been one of the main opponents of his 1997 recommendations. "I owe you an apology, Command Sergeant Major," the general said, his voice low as they waited for the ceremony to begin. 25 years ago, I told you some things weren't meant to change overnight. I was wrong." Washington studied the man's face, searching for sincerity. "What changed your mind, General?" "I watched what happened after Arlington," he replied. "Saw how quickly things improved once someone had the courage to force the issue. Made me wonder what else I've been wrong about." It was a small victory, but perhaps the most meaningful, changing the mind of someone who had once been an obstacle to progress. Washington had learned over his long career that institutional change happened person by person, conscience by conscience. In retirement communities across the country, similar conversations were taking place as veterans of Washington's generation reflected on the changes they'd witnessed and the roles they had played, or failed to play, in advancing equality. These quiet personal reckonings were perhaps as important as the policy changes themselves. Washington's story became a touchstone in discussions about military culture and institutional racism. Young officers cited his example during debates about other persistent inequities. His methodical approach to documentation became a template for addressing various forms of discrimination throughout the armed forces. Elizabeth Hayes established an annual award in her husband's name, recognizing service members who demonstrated exceptional commitment to equality and inclusion. Washington served on the selection committee, helping to identify individuals who were carrying forward the work he had begun. During the third year of the award ceremony, Washington met a young female sergeant who had documented gender discrimination in combat training assignments. Using Washington's methodology, she had compiled evidence, cited regulations, and pursued change through proper channels. "Your story showed me how to fight effectively," she told him. "Not with anger, but with facts and persistence." Washington smiled, recognizing something of himself in her determined expression. "The next generation always builds on the work of those who came before," he said. "That's how progress happens." As Washington entered his late 70s, he began compiling his experiences into a memoir titled The Long Watch: One Soldier's Fight for Equality in the Ranks. The book chronicled not just his confrontation at Arlington, but the dozens of smaller stands he had taken throughout his career. "These are not just my stories," he wrote in the introduction. "They belong to every service member who has ever had to fight for the respect they've already earned. I share them now in the hope that future generations will face fewer such battles, but will be better equipped to win them when they come." When a reporter asked if Washington felt his work was finished, the old veteran shook his head. "The work is never finished," he replied. "But it doesn't all have to be done by the same people. I've carried my part of the load. Now I'm passing the baton." On his 80th birthday, Washington received a surprise visit from General Davis, now serving in the Pentagon. Davis brought news that the military-wide integration protocols that had grown from Washington's stand at Arlington were being expanded to address other forms of subtle discrimination. "Your ripple has become a wave," Davis told him, "and it's still spreading." Washington thought about the young black lieutenant who had been redirected at Hayes's funeral, now a major on track for his own command. He thought about the cadets at West Point studying his case, learning to recognize injustice before it became entrenched. He thought about the uncomfortable conversations happening in officers' clubs and veterans' halls across the country. Change didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in thousands of small decisions, in questions asked and assumptions challenged, in procedures examined and traditions reconsidered. Washington had spent his life planting seeds of change. Only now, in his final years, was he witnessing the full harvest. As he drove away from Arlington for what he knew might be the last time, Washington reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple desire to honor his friend. Sometimes, the most important battles weren't fought on foreign soil, but on home ground, in quiet moments of personal courage. Sometimes the most significant changes came not from dramatic confrontations, but from meticulous documentation and unwavering persistence. These were the touching stories that rarely made headlines, but transformed institutions from within. Real-life stories of quiet revolution fought with dignity and determination rather than violence. These black stories of persistence and principle formed an essential thread in the larger American tapestry, too often overlooked until someone like Washington refused to be silent any longer. For every story like Washington's that comes to light, countless others remain untold. Have you witnessed someone standing up against systemic discrimination? Share your experience in the comments below. If you're a veteran with similar experiences, positive or negative, your perspective matters. The conversation about institutional change begins with honest accounts from those who've lived through it. Share this video to spark important conversations about how small acts of courage can create lasting change. Subscribe to Beat Stories for more stories of everyday heroes creating extraordinary transformations in their communities. What everyday injustice will you refuse to accept tomorrow?
This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of what happens when truth meets visibility. At Beat Stories, we believe exposure is the first step to transformation. Subscribe and stay tuned, because the next story might be yours.